Thank you, Lori, and hello, everybody. I'm Norma Levy, the president of New Plaza Cinema. We really welcome you to our program. Today, we look forward to a very important discussion about the 2017 Hungarian film, 1945. I'm pleased to introduce our host, the author, film historian, and film critic, Max Alvarez, whom many of you know well. Max, please begin.
Thank you so much, Norma. Good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure to see people at this very special event for New Plaza Cinema, which has been very generously sponsored by Nancy Fisher, who I'll be talking with momentarily. We are, of course, this is Mother's Day, but we're also acknowledging Holocaust Awareness today. This is also the anniversary of VE Day, marking the European end of World War II. And of course, the film 1945, it begins on August 13th, after VE Day, when the entire war is about to come to an end. We're going to be discussing the film today. We're going to be discussing the filmmaking, but we'll also have a very, very special guest, Rachel Baum, Deputy Director at the Sam and Helen Stahl Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We'll be meeting her momentarily. For those who are not able to attend today's special program, I'm happy to report that it will be posted on New Plaza Cinema's website in the days ahead. If you go to Talks and Lectures, you will be able to access today's presentation and share it with those who wanted to attend but were unable to. This Hungarian film concerns two Jewish survivors of the Holocaust who return to a Hungarian village at this time in 1945 in August, and the very uncomfortable reactions from the local villagers, some of whom fear that that Jews are going to be coming back to reclaim property that was stolen from them at the time of the deportations. There are those who are facing guilt, those who are facing shame, and those who just don't understand what the problems were to begin with. This is a haunting, beautifully designed film. And before we discuss it further, I would love to introduce today's very generous sponsor, Nancy Fisher. Nancy, who has been involved extensively in interviewing and researching the Holocaust for over 25 years. Nancy, first of all, thank you so much for your support of today's program. It's a pleasure to have you back. There's a Hungarian aspect to your research that you've done, and I think there's kind of an inside track you have on the general theme of the setting of today's film. Could you share a little bit of that with us?
Thank you, Max. I had the privilege early on in the years of interviewing for the USC Shoah Foundation, of being assigned to interview the foremost historian on the Holocaust in Hungary, Rudolph Baum. And he became a mentor to me. He taught me a great deal and enabled me to interview, through his mentorship and his scholarship, interview survivors, Hungarian survivors of the Holocaust. And the first deportations took place in the communities, in the Orthodox communities outside of Budapest. There was somewhat of a sweep of a clock from the time that the Germans marched into Hungary on the 19th of March in 1944 until the deportations were stopped on July 7th of 1944 to Auschwitz. And by that time, some 450,000 had been scooped up from their communities, taken to the local or larger cities where there were train lines, put on those trains and sent to Auschwitz, many to their death. So this is a very specific chapter in the Holocaust in Hungary. It does not include what happened to the Jews in Budapest, but it's very important.
And when we were discussing it briefly the other day, you'd mentioned, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about this with Rachel, there were aspects to the story that the film downplayed or didn't quite address, which was the film generally deals with the local community, people in the villagers being implicated by not intervening in this crime. But you were indicating that the crime went a little higher than the villages to the municipal level and the political level.
Yes, we talked about silence and absence in this film, which are both very powerful. The villagers clearly feel, I wouldn't say remorse, but tremendous guilt about what happened. I'm not sure. It isn't clear that they even know what happened to their neighbors. But it was the Hungarian gendarmerie, the local police, who do not have a presence in this film, who rounded up the Jews in those communities outside of Budapest. The neighbors may have stood by, waiting to go in and take things, and not having been sorry to see their Jewish neighbors go, but that's their guilt. But the physical gathering of the Jews belonged to the Hungarian gendarmerie.
And there's a tiny little reference to the gendarmerie when the local woman, who I think is the mother of the bride, and I apologize if I'm mistaken, when she talked about offering to hide a Jewish boy on her premises, and then she got scared. She did mention the gendarmerie or someone from the gendarmerie approaching or arriving, and then they don't pursue that. But there's one mention, and I'm curious also, who is the uniformed man who's following the magistrate around? Is he with the gendarmerie? Is he a local police official? I'm just curious to hear more people's thoughts on that. But
I don't remember that.
Oh, this isn't a test, but this is something that'll be fodder for discussion.
But the man who rides the motorcycle that the
Yes.
magistrate is riding alongside with.
That's the one I was referencing. So in any event, we're looking forward to talking more about the film. Is there anything, Nancy, you'd like to add about the subject of Hungary and the subject matter this time?
No, I've certainly seen many films, in all these years, as many people who are interested in the subject of the Holocaust generally, but this one is particularly haunting. It just is. And I think the fact that it's in black and white makes it even more powerful. And we have a chance to engage with these characters in the village and what they've done and their complicity. And we don't really engage with the two that show up until their gesture at the very end in the cemetery, in the Jewish cemetery. But clearly they are not from that village. I think that's, nobody knows them, they don't recognize them. And what is their purpose? It's very mysterious, but very, very powerful. So I hope people who are part of this talkback have had the chance to see the film either for the first time or again.
Yes, because it definitely demands multiple viewings, because I was so busy. I had seen it originally when it came to the old Lincoln Plaza. And then today I was busy taking notes, but I look forward to seeing it again without interruption, because there's so many little nuances to capture. Well, what I'd like to do now is to go ahead and show the trailer for 1945. Nancy was mentioning the haunting look of the film in black and white. Dan Cahill, who we just heard from briefly, is going to talk more about the photographic look of 1945. But let's now take a look at the actual trailer from this 2017 motion picture.
Be kéne vigyél a városba.
Az esküvője napján?
Visznek is valamit, vagy csak hoztak?
Új világ van. Nem számít ki úr, ki paraszt. Csak magyar legyen. Zsidók jöttek. És hányan vannak? Egyelőre ketten. És mi a rossz sövet akarnak? Bosszút? Vissza kell adni mindent. Ki fog derülni minden.
Rossz előérzetem van.
Jól jöttem. Ilyenkor a jegyző és a feleségem, ők íratták alá velem a feljelentést. A ház, a bútorok.
Ez a miénk. Itt minden a miénk. Gyilkos vagy. Mindenki tudja.
Director Ferenc Turok has directed 21 feature films since the late 90s. The majority of them have not gotten much exposure here in the United States. And this is one of his more recent films. So if the films before that are anywhere near the quality of 1945, we've been missing out on a great deal. A couple of other names that are worthy of mention. The cinematographer, if there are any Hungarians in the audience, I apologize for my pronunciation, but I don't know if Daniel has learned how to pronounce this remarkable cinematographer's name. It looks like Feni Krepesti Ragali Elemer. He has been photographing films in Hungary since the late 1960s, including 4 features for the Hungarian filmmaker Judith Elek. And Dan is going to talk more about the astonishing black and white visuals. This appears to have been photographed in high definition video. And the Eastern Bloc countries, their film industries have always mastered monochromatic cinematography brilliantly throughout the 1950s, 60s, and beyond. The composer, Zene Sesmo Tibor, has scored mostly documentaries, and Dan has also spoken about music, and maybe we can discuss later on the very ominous, very sparse musical score that appears at periodic moments in the film that later transitions to more traditional Jewish themes, or at least a Jewish theme to the music. And of course, the actor who stands out, who we saw extensively in the trailer, is Peter Rudolph, who has primarily made films in Hungary, most of which we have not seen here, who plays the town boss, Istvan, the town clerk, the village magistrate, who is obviously trying to conceal the skeletons in his closet and the responsibility he must bear for the confiscating of the land by the Jews who have been deported from their village. What I would like now, however, is to introduce our special guest from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Rachel Baum is Deputy Director of the Stahl Center for Jewish Studies at UWM, where she teaches courses on the Holocaust, Jewish culture, and film. She also teaches a course on Holocaust film in Yeshiva University's MA program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Her expertise is on the representations of the Holocaust in literature and film, and her current research looks at Holocaust memory in new media, such as holograms and virtual reality. She has presented her work in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Israel, and at the USC Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles. Needless to say, Dr. Baum, it is a great honor to have you with us at New Plaza Cinema Online.
It is a pleasure to be here.
For starters, what is your general emotional connection or response to 2017? I'm sorry, this was the film made in 2017, 1945, and how does it fit in with some of the other films on the Holocaust that you have talked about and discussed?
You know, this is definitely a film, in my opinion, that requires multiple viewings, because I think it's a film that unfolds, and the more time that you, at least I can speak for myself, the more time I've spent with this film, the more dimensions to the film that I've seen. Because at first you're just trying to figure out, you know, sort of what's going on, especially for viewers who may be less familiar with the history. And then as you keep watching it, you notice more details and more symbolism in a really fascinating way.
Historically, is there something you can share with us about some of these rural communities in Hungary at the similar to the villages we might have seen in this film?
Absolutely. You know, I think what's important for the viewer to know is that this is that there's a version of this story all over Europe. But the specificity of the Hungarian experience is so important and is really at the heart of this film, because the Hungarian Jewish community was the largest intact Jewish community during the Holocaust. So they're still intact in 1944. So like, just to think about, you know, a year and a half before the war will end, there are 800,000 Jews still in Hungary and lands controlled by Hungary. And then in a period of 56 days, those Jews are deported, over 437,000 of them in a period of 56 days are deported to Auschwitz, where 75% of them are murdered. So the tragedy of Hungary, right? The tragedy of it being so late in the war and such a mass murder is important to this story. And then the other dimension of that is that what allowed so many Jews to be murdered was the participation of the Hungarian population, right? The participation, as Nancy was saying, of the gendarmerie, of really an infrastructure that supported this. So you have, you know, a Holocaust survivor like Isabella Leitner, who was deported from Budapest, saying, I didn't see a German until I got to Auschwitz, right? So that all of that is happening, right, with your town, you know, your community's people, your nation, you know, your brothers and sisters, as it were, you know, on a national level. And so I think that's really important, that often, at least my students, think about like Nazis as, you know, Nazis and Jews, and we think in these kind of bifurcated ways that don't see all of the complicity of local governments and townspeople, which you see in this film.
What accounts for the fact that it wasn't until 1944 when these mass deportations took place?
You know, it's really interesting that you asked that, because one point that I really want to make sure that viewers are thinking about with this film is that it's a film literally about 1945, it's in the title, but it's a film that, of course, comes out in 2017. And the film itself is trying to intervene into memory debates, right? Like, how will we remember the Holocaust? And the question that you raised is actually at the heart of some of the memory debates, right? That question of, oh, was it because, so there are forces in Hungary who want to say, oh, it's because we protected our Jews, right? And that's why. And the truth is actually that that there were political reasons, right? Especially as the war is winding down, and Miklos Horthy sort of sees the writing on the wall and sees that, well, the Germans are probably going to lose this, and maybe we want to try to make some, you know, a separate peace with the Allies. And then the Germans respond to, you know, seeing that, respond and occupy Hungary, as Nancy said, in March of 1944, March 19th, 1944.
Was there, let me ask you this, do you buy into the guilt and shame a number of the characters exhibit in the narrative of 1945?
You know, what I think is important, what as viewers, we see it individually, right? Like, is that character guilty? But I think that the filmmaker is actually trying to push people into seeing that each of those people, I think, actually represents, like, you could think of as like the local population. And I think the filmmaker wants us to, you know, whether guilt is the right word or not, I think the filmmaker wants Hungarians to think about the importance of anti-Semitism. Because the other thing that happens in these memory debates is that people can underplay the importance of anti-Semitism and think, oh, it was just politics and it was, but here you see, right, that the Jews come and the townspeople are afraid, oh, the Jews are here, and they're, you know, they're portrayed as these, you know, people to be feared. And that is, I don't know if you've read the short story that the film is based on, but it's quite strong in the short story called Homecoming, that he has the screenwriter who wrote the short story, Gabor Santo, has the townspeople saying anti-Semitic things like, well, they had too much money anyway, and right, and so you have more of that basis even. So I think he wants us to see that the anti-Semitism.
I mean, what I found fascinating was the package, or that container that was being taken from the train, which we are told contains cosmetics and perfume.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious to know, how was that conveyed when they got off the train? And word spread throughout the village very quickly. And you think that I call him the town boss, but this is the magistrate, the wonderful performance by Peter Rudolph. Initially, you almost think that he's fearing competition with his drugstore. Are they going to set up a business? Are they going to try to undersell me on goods? That's what I thought he might be heading in that direction. I don't know if you had a reaction to that.
Yes, and I think it's fascinating that the original story is called Homecoming. And as Nancy pointed out, these Jews are not literally coming home. And yet, and I spent some time thinking about why it's important that they're not from this town, right? And how that would be different. And then maybe we would start thinking, well, who's right? But because they're not from the town, you see so plainly just the stereotypes and sort of discriminatory attitudes, and like they're going to try to take something from us, instead of the sense of, you know, let us help them, or, right, there's none of that. There's not
even from the priest, right? Not even from the local priest.
Right, that these were our neighbors, right? Again, they're not literally, but there's not that sense. And there were, you know, anti-Jewish pogroms after the war, right? And that's, again, how we know that anti-Semitism is, you know, it didn't start in 1933, of course. And in Hungary, the anti-Semitic laws actually started in 1920, right? So that they're like the first to start with anti-Jewish laws, right? Well before Hitler becomes chancellor in Germany, which is so interesting.
It was fascinating. That's amazing and powerful information. And it was fascinating with the Peter Rudolph character. It takes a brilliant actor to make us really sympathize with this sinister figure, because he's this really unlikable person. But then when he loses his son's respect, you can tell how devastating that is for him. And then everything goes downhill from there. And then, of course, his wife is totally disgusted with him as well. Fascinating character.
Absolutely. And I think that really interestingly ties into, I think the film is in part wanting to draw our attention to the generational issues, because the screenwriter is himself the child of survivors and the grandchild of survivors. And so, you know, in Germany, there's the like, what did you do during the war, daddy phenomenon. And here, this is a Hungarian version of it, right? Of like, okay, this happened, but now what are you going to do about it? And he loses, you know, the respect of his son, who again, not coincidentally goes off to a city, right? You asked before about like the importance of the countryside. And Nancy pointed out earlier that the way that the Jews were deported from Hungary was that they were pushed from these rural areas into the cities, into ghettos, sometimes only for a few days, and then deported to Auschwitz. So.
And I don't want to take the thunder away from Dan. Maybe he's going to reference this shot. I mean, there are too many memorable shots for me to reference, but I am thinking of late in the film, the scene at the train station when the two Jewish visitors arrive and you see the son of the magistrate is sitting there waiting for his train. Just the three of them. It says so much.
And I think, you know, that issue of generations and memory and the future, I think is part of what makes this film so powerful and important, because these debates, these memory debates are happening now. So sometimes with Holocaust films, we think we're seeing something in the past so we can learn about the past. But I think this is importantly 1945 because it wants us to learn about the present by how we narrate what happened in 1944 and 45. You know, and especially given, you know, that there have been anti-Semitic attitudes in Hungary today, I think that's part of what the filmmaker wants us to see.
Powerfully stated, and we have so much more to talk about regarding the film 1945. I would love now to turn the microphone over to Daniel Cahill, a filmmaker and a cinematography expert, who is going to talk about I don't envy his task because I think there's too many stunning images to discuss in 1945. But Dan, you're going to talk more about the visual look of the film. And welcome to this special presentation.
Well, thank you. And a welcome to all the mothers and grandmothers out there and great grandmothers. We're happy you're making a bit of a sacrifice to listen in today. I'm going to show you plenty of images here, and I'll try and dial them up promptly. One point that I want to make right off the bat is that what I'm going to be showing you are depictions of the village environment, and they describe a place which is, and we've used the word haunted a lot of times so far. It's haunted by its past. There is a lot of secrecy. The people are very furtive with each other, and that is the visual style that the director has used. And this visual style is not rare, it's very common, but it is used to an enormous extent in this film. Here is our friend Peter Rudolph playing the village magistrate, who, while he's shaving, looks at his drug-addicted wife through a lace curtain. Now, the idea of shooting through an object or around an object is not new. It always, for a lot of filmmakers, it adds a lot of richness and depth to the image. But here it's a fixture in virtually every scene. Here we see the station master, who has moved from his office, which we see through a window on the right side of this frame, and he goes behind this wooden wall, which shows some serious fire damage, until he emerges at the other side to watch for the train that's arriving. Here we see the drug-addicted wife having closed the door to the bedroom, and we're now looking back at her as her husband did through the same lace curtain. There is always an obstruction between the people, and it suggests that everyone is, well, I've used the word furtive, perhaps illicitly peeping on the other people in the town, and how rare it is for them to actually look each other in the eye when they're having dialogue. Here is the town clerk leaving his home, and we see this through the window frame in his home. And later, when he returns home, they reverse the shot, and we watch him coming up the steps through the same window frame. Here he is again, taking care of business. His motorcycle driver has taken him around, and we see him walking through an agricultural area, and he is obscured partially by the crops that everybody is working on. Here is the station master in the foreground and the train conductor in the background, and they're trying to figure out what is going on with these two people who have just mysteriously arrived, framed by the window in his office. Always some sort of frame or obstruction to the view between the people. Here we are at what should be a jolly wedding ceremony, but there aren't that many people there. And the table with a lot of the empty bottles is obscuring some of the action here. Here we see him talking to his son, who is going to renounce his upcoming wedding that day. What do we have in the frame? Laundry hanging out to dry, obstacles in between the people. This is another beautiful shot where we're watching the wagon move towards the village, and we're looking across what appears to be a freshly harvested crop. The two Jews are walking behind the wagon, and a lantern, usually a symbol of illumination and clarity, is now used to obscure the movements of these two men as they're approaching. The station master on his bicycle racing through the countryside, through foliage, vegetation, blocking our view of him. Here is, once again, the town magistrate who has just left his, and I'll put that in quotes, his drugstore, and we watch him leave through a curtain on the door. We now see the wagon approaching the village, and we have a cross, probably marking a cemetery of some sort, although we don't really see much else. We see them in the village now through a gap in a wooden fence. We never see the entire wagon or the two men following it, but we see them glimpsed through this gap. And now they're approaching the Jewish cemetery. We know because, as we see here, there is a Star of David in iron in the gate to the cemetery. So we know where they're headed. This is another favorite shot of mine. This is when Istvan's son, the bridegroom on that day, goes to talk to his fiance, and he closes the door, and these two women who apparently are friends with the fiance are eavesdropping, or at least lip reading, through another curtain on a doorway. This is something that Rachel explained to me, a part of the ritual mourning process. It's sort of a modern day equivalent of the rending of garments, and the young man puts a rip in the lapel of the older man. Here is something that you almost have to be told is there. On the young man's left arm, we see part of a number tattooed on his arm, and we all know what that means. Here we have more items being obscured, this time by flames. Istvan is burning things in his office, and I can only suspect that this might be a photo of the Pollock family, who were escorted out of town and lost their drugstore to the town magistrate. This is a shot I have to respect as a filmmaker. It doesn't look particularly fake. And I respect people who are willing to wait for the right weather to make the shot look dynamic. Storm clouds on the horizon. And here we have the final shot of the film, which I found terribly moving. We saw a big black plume of smoke when the train arrives in the town. And now the train is leaving, and the camera stays on the departing train until it gets very small in the frame. And then the camera pans left with the plume of smoke that is billowing and dissipating in the breeze. And this, well, it pretty much sums up the final destination of all the Holocaust victims. They are human smoke. With that, I will sign off. And welcome back, Max and Rachel.
Dan, thank you so much. That was a beautiful observation. And if I'm not mistaken, the burning photos that you referenced, I believe they returned to that image when the bride has set fire to the drugstore, and those are it's the family album from the Jewish family that they found, that the young man found in the storage room. I believe that's what that was from. But
Well, this invites another comment I wanted to make in response to something Rachel said the other day, which is this is a film about memory. Well, it's also a film about willful amnesia, the lack of memory, and the hoops and things that people jump through to make that work for themselves. And it is so obvious that everyone in this movie has something to fear, something to hide, and it is very well rendered in nuanced and subtle ways.
in the end credits, there was a little bit of a humor, perhaps unintentional. I loved how there was the one of the people credited in the credits was a colorist. Even in a black and white movie, you have to adjust the look of the black and white when you're editing it. I thought that was that was kind of amusing. And then I had a question for Rachel. We're used to all kinds of logos appearing at the end of movies these days. There's a reference to the Claims Conference. Does that ring a bell? Anything you can share with us about what that was about?
Absolutely. So the Claims Conference, I think its full name is Claims Conference of Material Claims Against Germany, is the organization that manages restitution for Holocaust survivors. And so, of course, this film is so much about what is and isn't given back, right, after the end of the war. And in our country, well, and around the world, the Claims Conference is the organization that oversees that work.
Thank you for explaining that. And Dan, did you have any comments about the music? I love the sparseness of the score, and it's this very, in the beginning, it's a very ominous effects type of music score in the beginning, that once we see the two Jews heading towards the Jewish cemetery, we hear Jewish themes. But did anything strike you? Because it's not intrusive at all during the film, which I think is so important.
Interesting that you would ask that.
Not to put pressure on you or anything.
No, it's fine, because I didn't have a special reaction to the music. I thought it seemed in keeping with the film. And then I went and looked up the New York Times review of this film. And it was largely praising the film until the last paragraph. The critic, who I can't remember, it might have been Ben Kenigsberg, I'm not sure, but he said, but the movie is not perfect. And he lashed into the soundtrack. He just did not like the way the cues of the music were used dramatically in the film. Can't please everybody, I guess. But I thought it worked just fine.
I'm very sensitive to music cues, and I did not feel that the music was intrusive or in any way.
Me neither. But anyway, it also seemed well sourced for, I know nothing about the music of rural Hungary, but it all felt like it blended in together for me. I don't know. Rachel, do you know anything about the music of rural Hungary?
I don't, but I did pick up on the Jewish melodies as, and I don't know if you were going to say something about that, Max.
No, not at all, except that I wanted to know more.
So, I'm not a musicologist, but, as they're walking into the cemetery, I did pick up on what I believe is melodies from Yom Kippur, from Yom Kippur, from the Jewish Day of Atonement. And so that would make sense, given what's happening there. And, thinking about, again, the larger questions that you were raising, Dan, about the lack of atonement, or among some of the characters. Obviously there's some atonement, and it's interesting that they would put it around the Jewish cemetery, since there's no atonement there, but although there's grieving. So I thought that that was, again, just an interesting way of dropping in something that some people might notice and others might not notice.
This is not a small question, Rachel, but was there any resolution to the land property confiscation issue of the Jews who were deported after the war? Was there restitution?
I could say
ever resolved?
no. I could just say no. But of course, the question is more complicated, and we still see that today, in terms of artwork and those kinds of possessions that were stolen from Jews. And what's interesting here is that you can see I don't want to say rightful, but the film lets you see their perspective that they say, well, we bought this, right? So the fact is that they bought it from, some of them we're led to believe did buy it at incredibly reduced prices, right? Because it was taken from the Jews. And then they think, well, no, this is ours and we have the title to it, right? And nobody's going to take it from us. And you just really get into that moral complexity. And so, some people might remember from, if you've seen Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, right, that there's a point, and again, you may not remember this, it's a long film, but where he says, tell me about your house. Do you like your house? How long have you been living here? Right? Because the house that the person is living in belonged to Jews, right? And what do you do with that? And what do you do when you think about, again, all of these questions of ownership, if somebody's lived there for several years and they start to think of it as their home. And again, maybe they did buy it in this case, in the 1945 film. Sometimes items were just stolen. Sometimes they were purchased at an incredible discount. And that's, I think, the complexity of the complicity here.
These stories are still in today's headlines. People who are still trying to recover stolen or confiscated artwork in particular because of its value. This is 80 years later and it's still going on. It's still part of the narrative.
And, I always make the point to my students that when we think about the Holocaust, we think rightly about the loss of human life. That is absolutely the most important part of that story. But also we need to attend to the money involved. Right. And that's also a really important thread that led people to not fight, maybe not stand up. Right. It's part of the complexity that people got rich. People got things that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise because their neighbors were murdered. And that's a very difficult reality to sit
and
with.
Also, thank you. And also, there are those three words that come out of the woman's mouth who was originally planning to take in the Jewish boy. She said, I was scared, and it's convincingly presented. I can imagine the abject terror that must have been going through the minds of some people who were just afraid to do anything.
I think the film does try, and I'll be curious to think what you two both think, but I think that the film does take pains to show us a variety of responses, right? Some people who feel so much guilt, right? That, the character of Bandy, who takes his life because he feels so much guilt. And then, of course, other people who feel completely entitled. And we have this, again, so fear and greed, right? And entitlement. And we have all of it represented in this film.
Now, I'm notorious for missing key points in narratives. My wife is always making fun of me about that. So, but because I'm so busy studying the look and the editing and the music, there's the scene where the magistrate is presumably in his office or somewhere, and he's setting fire to a promissory note. Can you shed more light on that for me, what that was relating to?
So part of the film is that the pressure to sign, right? So it's interesting. This is a side note, but I was interested in the way, and again, I will leave some of these issues to the two of you, but I was interested in the way that the film uses a variety of iconography that we see in other Holocaust films. And so I kept thinking about paper in this film, right? That in Schindler's List, we have that paper being life, the list is life. And here we have these examples of paper being a problem, right? That being forced to sign the accusation. And there we're led to believe that it's a promissory note that would restore rightful ownership, right? We're just watching this until you come back. And this again was something that often neighbors said. Maybe they meant it when they said it. And then after having the fruits of that, they no longer wanted to give it back. And sometimes they didn't mean it when they said it. And so he's got this evidence that if the Polak family comes back, it will be theirs. And he wants to eliminate the evidence. And again, that's part of why restitution has been so difficult, because it's not just that that items were taken, but any paperwork that would show a person's claim to it was taken. So then how do you reconstitute that a place was rightly yours? If, as Dan said, there's so much amnesia, and then people aren't, you can't rely on the community to say, oh yeah, that was rightly yours.
Well, paper is very powerful in human society. It can grant life and death. And people here realize that, and they're doing the best they can to either exploit or destroy the paper. So
while we're talking about symbols, I also wanted to make sure that, I don't know if you were going to get to this, Max, but I want to make sure we get to what's in the box. And your thoughts
please.
about.
Yes, so I know that there was the prayer shawl, and then there were children's shoes. But tell us more about that.
Well, I'd be interested in how you both read it, but in the original story, Homecoming, it's actually bars of soap.
Ooh.
And
Wow.
yeah, and I think because that was such a strong belief, and current history says it was maybe something they were attempting, but it was not, it didn't happen as much as people thought it happened. So I assume that for all of those reasons, right, that didn't make it into the film, but instead we have what I really see as these symbols of, I think that their symbolic factor is so powerful, right? We lost our children, we lost our religious culture, right? And so you have the shoes, you have the train, the toy train, right? Which is also interesting, right? And you have these religious prayer shawl and tefillin, which also are used by men for daily prayer. And I think that was so powerful, right? Those specific, and the prayer book, right? So religion and
more so than if they had been bringing in actual human remains. I think the symbols speak far more powerfully for the losses that they've suffered.
Hey, guys, I think
They
we
are-
Nancy, please, yeah, you'd like, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but Rachel, they're all symbols of life. Jewish life and family life, that's what they are.
absolutely. But I think, also here in this case, right, representing what was lost. Yeah, absolutely though. Well, and just again, thinking about that, from Schindler's List, from the Talmud, he who saves a life, saves the world entire. He who takes a life, takes the world entire. For me, when I see those shoes, right, I think about the children that won't grow up, about all of their children, right? So that's the power of that.
I would like to, just in the larger sense of talking about the look of the film, just pay great tribute to whoever the casting person was in this film. The faces that we see, the first close-up face we see is the older man who is driving the wagon. And he's rolling a cigarette, and he's kind of looking askance at the train as it comes in. That is a face that says, I have lived a lot and I've seen a lot. And then the other one is the actor who played Bondi, the town drunk.
Oh, he was amazing.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you have a heart of stone if you don't feel for this guy and the pain he's trying to wash down his gullet. This is a powerful film, and everybody's using the word haunting, and we can't say that too much. It's really has an effect on people.
I'm glad you mentioned the actors, Dan. The other day when we were talking about the film, Nancy raised a good point, and she said I'm not trivializing the subject matter, but in many ways I was reminded a bit of the Western High Noon. And I understand what she means, because it is set in a very set time frame. The waiting for the train is very important. The behavior of the townspeople, not wanting to be involved or not wanting to really be supportive of the people who are trying to find justice or seek some answers rather.
Let alone the pitchforks.
Exactly.
It's like the old Universal horror films with, storming the castle with the pitchforks.
Well, and also as I was watching it, as there were some other Westerns that came to mind. I mean, early on, when the train has arrived and the two visiting Jews are getting the crates off the train, you're hearing some of this ominous, subtle music, and you're also hearing the incessant, what would you call that? Not the chugging, but the hissing of the locomotive. It's this repetitive grinding sound that reminded me very much of a famous Western, The Wild Bunch. There's a very famous train robbery scene there where all you hear is this hissing and steam coming out of the train while a robbery is taking place. And then, although this is not technically a Western because it was set I think it's in contemporary time, but there was the 1955 John Sturges film Bad Day at Black Rock, where Spencer Tracy is going to a small town in the Southwest that has a skeleton in its closet. Nobody wants to talk. And he's unraveling a terrible case of a local Japanese man who was killed during World War II due to prejudice. And the fact that the community there was this conspiracy of silence and complicity reminded me very much of what we see here. I haven't read an interview where the director cites those films, but I would imagine there might have been some influences there. Just a theory.
I think,
and as I say, not to take away from the powerful theme, but I just thought it was beautifully rendered here.
Agreed. There are a few things, only one of which I think we have time for me to bring up, that are still a little puzzling, a little too elliptical. And one of them is the sequence where her name is Rosie, who was the bride-to-be, is running barefoot at top speed into the center of town to get to the drugstore. And following behind her is the Jeep of the Russian soldiers who are kind of careening all over the road behind her. Is it fair to assume that they were harassing her in some way and she's running away from them? It's hard to know. Do you have any thoughts?
Rachel, did anything jump out at you?
well, remember that, Russia is what will liberate, the forces that will liberate Budapest, but also then, of course, Hungary becomes a communist country. And what'd you say?
It becomes an SSR, as the crossword puzzle is abbreviated all the time.
And so I think to have, some of the challenge of how are we going to represent the Russians in the film, right? Given all of the symbolism of the film, I think is that they're not completely threatening, but they're not completely unthreatening either.
Well, there's the moment in the early part of the film where one of the soldiers tries to take the cap off the young man's head. That's intimidating and kind of anti-Semitic. So
and it's certainly indicating that what's coming up in this next round of Stalinism is not going to be very pleasant.
Right.
That the problems are not over.
And that there's not going to be a way for Jewish identity to exist and flourish, right? And so there's like that anti-Jewish bit too. And I just wanted to mention about the issue of the Western. I think too, you see the filmmaker lets the viewer see how nonsensical anti-Semitism is, right? Because here are these like two very distinguished, and you know what I mean? Like they hold themselves upright. They are very calm and, and everyone's saying the Jews are coming, right? The Jews are coming, and the whispers. And so I think it's a way of showing us, oh yeah, why why are they fearing these people who have done nothing?
Yeah, no, that's very well stated. And I know we have probably a lot of questions, a lot of comments in chat, and that we're going to be sharing
Yeah,
momentarily.
good questions
and,
too.
And Lori's going to assist us with that. Before we get to the questions from everyone, I just want to remind us that on Wednesday, May 18th, I will be giving a talk on the crime films of director Anthony Mann, who's best known for his Westerns, but I wrote a book that's coming out and that's now out in the softcover on the crime films of Anthony Mann. And I will be discussing Mann's career in the 1940s.
This is the day. This is the day.
The haunting voice of Claire Trevor. So that will be on the 18th, and then on the 22nd, we're going to be discussing for our next talk back a Western that Anthony Mann directed, The Naked Spur, with James Stewart. So we look forward to seeing everyone at those programs.
Okay.
So Lori,
I have
carry
a
on.
question, but there's only one hand raised. Before we go to that question, someone had asked a question. Some might query the way the Jewish characters are essentially noble ciphers, which is a quote from the Guardian review. Someone is curious what Rachel thinks about that.
You know, it's an interesting question, and also, yeah, I see there's also a question above about the bars of soap. I don't know if I could just really quickly, that there was a belief that that the Nazis made Jews into bars of soap, and so that's again, that's largely mythical, but that's what what that was referencing it from the original story. The issue of how the Jews are represented is really interesting because they are not complex characters, right? We don't know. And in a lot of ways, this is a film about the townspeople, right? It's about their complicity and how they see it or don't see it. And in a way, the Jews, I think, are meant to be screens, right? That they, like, it's interesting, Dan, that you brought up all of the screens that we see. Like, the Jews themselves are these screens that the townspeople put their own feelings onto. But I also find them not unsympathetic, right? They are, we know what they've been through. We see the number, right? They somehow managed to hold themselves up despite having been through monstrosities. So I find myself as a viewer being quite sympathetic to them, and also relieved that they're okay in the end, right? Like, the issue that those people with the pitchforks could turn against the Jews seems completely plausible, and we know, as I said, is historically completely plausible. So I was relieved when they were okay at the end of the film.
I had a question. Were they walking because it was the Sabbath?
Was it the Sabbath?
I don't know.
I don't think that was ever stated.
I just was wondering what would be their justification for not riding, and the only thing I could come up with is it might have been Sabbath, but I don't remember any reference. It's the only thing I could think of.
I think it's because trucks and carts were so much part of the Holocaust experience, right? That, and again, thinking about the fact, why should these Jews trust these Hungarians?
Kind of like,
these are literally the people who sent them to the camps.
right.
So when they say, oh, we'll give you a ride on the truck, They say we'll walk. That's what I made of it.
Okay. Marjorie, can you start your video and your audio, please?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point too. Walking as if they were following a coffin.
Well, I
Oh,
was
that's an
thinking
even better answer,
Gosh,
David.
Yeah, yeah,
That's powerful.
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm still not clear on why they picked this town and not their hometown. I know it went over, but I'm not clear on that.
I would conjecture that they would send people where they weren't known, so it wouldn't provoke a more intense personal reaction. They were just simply representatives of the community of victims, and rather than an individual that someone might have had a dispute with in the past. But that's a very pragmatic decision that may not have anything to do with that. I don't know.
No, I think that's probably a very good one, but they just didn't want any personal conflict, so they picked an unknown town. Okay, I do accept that. Thank you, Dan.
Sure.
Yeah, we have some thoughts about that, why they were walking. One person said as if it was following a coffin, which we've already mentioned. They were walking because the driver told them to walk after the boxes were loaded on the car. I don't remember that. And then someone said, no, not the Sabbath. It was the sign of respect. The boxes were coffins. And also they did not want any help from these collaborators.
And then that they say also, I believe this was their hometown. They knew the cemetery.
Right.
But I didn't get enough of a clear idea that they were from the town, but
I think they were really there to, like Rachel said, to be the catalyst for the townspeople's reactions. They're very, they're just walking behind this cart and everyone's reading into them what they want to see or believe, so they come across as very non-threatening to perhaps the audience, but incredibly threatening because of what their own thoughts, minds, and hearts are feeling. Just my 2 cents.
general question for Rachel. It's so easy in making a film that touches on the Holocaust to be very exploitive and to sensationalize and especially violence. And this was a very dignified and tasteful film about a harrowing subject. Do you have any thoughts on filmmakers who make decisions to go this way versus a more explicit way or graphic way?
It's interesting because when I teach my course on Holocaust film, I teach it chronologically. And so you actually do see sort of less and less violent. Again, there's some exceptions, but there is sort of a moving away, almost because we assume that the viewer has seen that, right? And so, like, do you need to see that again, or what do you now need to know that maybe you didn't know before? So I think it's interesting that Auschwitz is not part of this film explicitly, but if you know the history of the Jews of Hungary, Auschwitz is completely part of this story. And so it's interesting to think, Dan had asked when we met earlier, like, what would an average viewer know and not know, like both in this country and in Hungary, and, and how much do you need to know in order to make sense of this film? I think is an interesting question. It's hard for me sometimes to think what are people who are not Holocaust scholars making of this film, and what do they know and not know? And clearly, I think you can access these questions of complicity and
let's
violence.
not forget, and I brought this up in our rehearsal last week, but America is now a place where in certain states it's illegal to teach something that might make someone uncomfortable. This is, they're banning books. This is what happens in an authoritarian government. And we've got some very strong tendencies that are starting to grow up right now. And I don't think any place is immune from these kinds of pressures.
That's why we must never forget, I mean, it's sort of a running theme, it's what most Jewish holidays are about, is remembering what happened so we don't forget and so that it doesn't happen again, They
Right,
tried to
and that we
tell
keep
us,
telling the
didn't,
story.
we
Yeah.
Well, because, and also we tend to forget that Hollywood wanted to forget. It was a good decade and a half after the war came to an end when 20th Century Fox made a Diary of Anne Frank, but the executives were saying, now be careful, we don't want to make this too much of a Jewish theme. It has to be more of an international theme. We don't want to alienate moviegoers. And they were still pulling that 15 years after the war, when the horrors were apparent to everyone. There was this reticence to deal head on with that issue. And it wasn't until the 1960s, and it took independent filmmakers at the time, like Sidney Lumet and The Pawnbroker, to push the envelope and say, well, wait a minute, we really need to start dealing with this.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Europeans had done that on different levels, but at least here we had been a little reticent.
Well, and I think Dan's point is really important too, that we do have these, I'll call them memory debates, but I think that's actually not a strong enough term. We have people disagree with the truth of history in certain places, both here and elsewhere. And I think this film really highlights how film can be such an important part of helping people to face the truth of history. Right? If it were a pamphlet, then maybe people would, say, oh, I don't want to read this, or, if it's a history book, oh, well, I don't know but they're going to see a film, and the power of film to be able to show them our people were complicit, right? That's what this film is saying, and we have to face that.
Well, in terms of film educating people, the story that I remember most vividly is that my daughter, when she was about 13, went to see Schindler's List by herself. She'd seen it once, and she went to see it a second time in the theater in Chelsea. And she found herself sitting next to an older man who had a visible tattoo on his arm. And they had a very interesting and warm-hearted discussion that I'm sure both of them benefited from. So in unexpected ways, film can really bring people together and share a lot of experiences.
Yeah, that's powerful.
That is very powerful. And then when a film is dealing on a specific historical incident, a lot of moviegoers may treat the film as the official record. And I see a film and I want to learn more, but a lot of people say, okay, I now know what happened, when the film may or may not be an accurate representation. So it's a powerful medium in a variety of ways.
Someone was wondering if you could speak to the Russian presence at the beginning and at the very end of the film. It seemed to be absent in between. Sort of bookends it.
Yeah, well, I think, the film, like it's fascinating, again, as you keep watching this film through multiple viewings, how you can see various symbols of, we could talk for another hour about all the symbols of this film. And I do think, how do we want to think about Russia is part of what this film is trying to get at, right? That after the Holocaust, Hungary will become under communist control. And that's clearly, why the film ends there. And I think the film wants us to see that with some complexity, that the Russians were liberators and also oppressors. Right. And how do we hold both in our hand? Again, it's part of the complexity. In a black and white film, there's also a lot of gray in this film.
Yes.
Right?
Well put.
A lot of gray.
Sometimes it being black and white helps the subject.
Exactly. You see all the shades. Absolutely.
You also tend to pay attention more. I think a black and white picture really grabs us because we're not always used to seeing a monochromatic narrative told. And I think we concentrate a lot more too as well.
Mhm.
Just to continue what Dan was saying about the wagon driver, somebody wrote, doesn't the face of the wagon driver remind anyone of the driver on the train to Treblinka in Showa? I remember that very long shot of the man pointing his head out of the train. And Rachel, any comments, or Dan, any comments on that?
I don't remember the the previously cited face. I'm sorry, Rachel.
It's interesting because it does, and I think it, to me, and I think it really highlights, and I can pull in another question that somebody asked about the ashes of Auschwitz in the pharmacy. I think it really shows, Max, you asked about this film alongside other Holocaust films. And I think when you see a Holocaust film, you bring in all of your other experiences, right? So like if you've seen Schindler's List, you're going to have resonances here. If you've seen Shoah, if you've seen The Pawnbroker, there are, Pawnbroker also uses a lot of grates and bright screens in its cinematography.
Boy in striped pajamas.
Yeah, so this film uses a lot of those symbols, but it's interesting that, so there's the fire, there's the hanging, there's the train, and it uses it differently, right? So here it's the Hungarians who are experiencing the fire, and except for the photo, of course, but so it's using, it's showing how they are not untouched by what happened, right? And the effects of this decision and this mass murder, and how it just expands to include this entire village.
Very powerfully stated, Rachel. Finally, does anyone want to speak to the subplot of the next generation leaving and the bride who will never marry? Someone writes in about that.
Well, they're not afraid to confront their elders. They're showing a lot more courage in the face of some of this reality that maybe they have been shielded from, and now that they're starting to see it, they're angry. And István's son wants to go to Budapest, I believe. Isn't that his destination throughout? So who can blame them? And you almost want to go up and pat him on the back.
Now I could be off, but I was, in my mind, was making the daughter, right, showing sort of about the flirtation, right? The flirtation with the Axis forces, the flirtation with the Allied forces. Oh, maybe we'll make peace here. And ultimately, of course, she does end up alone, right? So, and causes great destruction, right? So that because of her actions, she causes great destruction.
Well, this was a riveting discussion about a riveting motion picture. And Rachel, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us
Thank you
today.
for having me. This was so enjoyable.
Yeah.
No, it was a real pleasure having you. And Dan, of course, it's always a pleasure to hear your analysis. And Nancy Fisher, we thank you again on behalf of New Plaza Cinema for your generous support today of this special program. If there's anything else you wanted to add, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I will remind people that, go ahead, Nancy, if there's anything you'd like to say.
No, I appreciate every contribution that was made by the three of you to this program. It was, my husband was sitting here and it was really stunning. Makes me want to go back and watch that film.
We all should. I mean,
call me up. We'll talk more about it.
We will. And I also want to put in a plug to our West End cinema between Broadway and West End, where the man who normally would join us, Gary Palmucci, is brilliantly overseeing the theatrical experience there. I was there yesterday to see the French film Anaïs in Love, and it's a wonderful film, but it's a fabulous presentation, picture and sound. And so if you are in the New York area on the Upper West Side, we encourage you to get the big screen experience through New Plaza at our West End Theater. And of course, our website indicates showtimes and films Thursdays through Sundays.
May I interject with
Sure.
something that's also equally important to me? I serve as a trustee of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in Battery Park, and they are reopening the core exhibition of the museum July 1st, which is called The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do. That is the new core to the museum. So for people who are watching and who know the museum or don't know the museum, I invite you to come down and see this totally new exhibition on the Holocaust that the museum has created down at Battery Park.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That's very important information. Really appreciate it. And thank you again, Rachel and Dan. And
Thank you both.
Lori, I guess I'll turn things over to you. Certainly we'll see people at Anthony Mann on May 18th, and then in our talk back 2 weeks from now.
Well,
But thank you all for
said what
joining
I
us.
was going to say. So thank you all for joining us, and happy Mother's Day to all you mothers out there. Thank you. Have a great day.